The whispers started the morning. Helena Tucker buried her husband in the hard California earth. And by noon, the entire town of Watsonville had decided she was a murderer who poisoned him for his land. She stood at the graveside with dirt still clinging to her black dress. Her wheat-colored hair pulled back so tight it made her temples ache, and she could feel every pair of eyes boring into her back like hot iron brands. The preacher stumbled over his words, glancing nervously between her and the crowd that had gathered not to mourn but to witness, to judge, to condemn without trial or evidence. Thomas Tucker had been 53 years old when he collapsed in their kitchen 3 days prior, clutching his chest and gasping for air that wouldn't come. The doctor said it was his heart, worn out from years of hard drinking and harder living, but the town had other ideas. Helena was 24, and that alone was enough to convict her in their eyes. She had married Thomas 2 years earlier, a practical arrangement born of necessity rather than affection. Her father had died leaving debts that would have cost them their small farm, and Thomas had offered a solution: marriage in exchange for clearing those debts and providing for her ailing mother. It wasn't love, but it was survival, and Helena had learned early that survival sometimes required sacrifice. Thomas had been kind enough in his way, distant and often drunk, but never cruel. He had given her a roof and respectability, and she had given him a well-kept home and no complaints. When he died, she felt sadness for a life ended too soon, and relief that she might finally have a chance to live on her own terms. The town felt differently. "Poisoned him sure as I'm standing here, Mrs. Henderson had announced at the general store that morning, her voice carrying through the aisles like a proclamation. Young thing like that married to a man with property. She was just waiting for her chance. I heard she was seeing someone on the side," added Mrs. Cooper, though she had never heard any such thing. Probably wanted him out of the way so she could have the ranch and her lover both. The lies spread faster than wildfire through dry grass, each retelling adding new embellishments, new sins to lay at Helena's feet. By the time she walked from the cemetery back through town, women pulled their children close as she passed, and men watched her with expressions that mixed contempt with something darker, more predatory. She was alone now, unprotected, and marked as immoral. In 1882 California, that was a dangerous combination. She made it to the ranch as the sun began its descent toward the coastal hills, her feet aching and her throat tight with unshed tears. The Tucker Ranch was modest compared to some of the larger spreads in the valley, but it had good water and decent grazing land for the small herd of cattle Thomas had maintained. It should have been enough to support her, to give her independence, but Helena knew with bitter certainty that the town would never let her keep it. They would find ways to drive her out, to force a sale, to punish her for the crime of being young and widowed and unrepentant. She was drawing water from the well when she heard the horse approach. Her hand went instinctively to the rifle she had propped against the well side, but she didn't reach for it yet. The rider came into view slowly, a tall figure on a steel-gray horse, and even in the fading light she could see he was watching her with cautious interest rather than hostility. "Mrs. Tucker." His voice was low and measured, the kind of voice that didn't waste words or volume. "That's right." She straightened, one hand still near the rifle. "State your business." "Name is Nathan Miles. I worked for your husband last spring during the branding. He mentioned he might need help again come fall." He dismounted with easy grace, keeping his hands visible and his movements slow. "I'm sorry for your loss." Helena studied him in the dimming light. He was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were hard to read in the shadows. His clothes were worn but clean, his hat battered but well maintained. He had the look of a man who lived in the saddle, lean and weathered and self-sufficient. "I don't have money to hire help," she said flatly, "and I suspect I won't be keeping this place long enough to need it anyway." Nathan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Heard some of the talk in town. That why you've got the rifle close." "The rifle stays close because I'm a woman alone on a ranch, Mr. Miles. The talk just makes it more necessary." She turned back to the well, dismissing him. "I appreciate you coming by, but there's no work here for you. I'm not looking for wages." He didn't move toward her, didn't crowd her space, but his words stopped her hands on the bucket. "I'm looking for a place to work through the winter. Room and board would be enough." "Why?" She faced him again, suspicious now. "What do you care about my troubles or this ranch?" Nathan was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke there was something raw in his voice that made her believe him despite every instinct screaming not to trust. "Because I know what it's like when a whole town decides who you are without bothering to find out the truth. And because Thomas Tucker gave me fair wages and decent treatment when other ranchers ran me off for being half Shoshone. I figure I owe him, and I figure you could use someone who isn't afraid of what the gossips say." Helena felt something crack in her chest, some wall she had been building since Thomas fell. "I didn't kill him. I didn't poison him or wish him dead or any of the things they're saying. I know." Nathan's certainty was absolute, no hesitation or doubt. "Thomas talked about you sometimes. Said you were the best thing that happened to him, even if he knew he wasn't the best thing for you. Said you took care of him when you didn't have to, were patient when he was drunk, kind when he was mean. A woman like that doesn't turn poisoner over property." The tears she had been holding back all day finally spilled over, hot tracks down her cold cheeks. She turned away quickly, furious at herself for showing weakness, but Nathan didn't comment or move closer. He simply waited, holding his horse's reins and watching the darkening hills as if giving her privacy in the only way possible when they stood 10 feet apart in an open yard. "There's a bunkhouse," she said when she could speak again. "It's not much, but it's dry and the stove works. I can't pay you, but I can feed you and your horse." "That's more than enough, madam, Helena. If you're going to be here, you can call me Helena." "Helena, then." He touched the brim of his hat. "I'll bed down the horse and get settled. You need anything before dark?" "No." "Thank you, Mr. Miles." "Nathan." She almost smiled, would have if the day hadn't been so impossibly heavy. "Nathan." He led his horse toward the small barn, and Helena carried her water bucket to the house, feeling less alone than she had since Thomas collapsed. She didn't trust easily, had learned young that trust was a luxury poor girls couldn't afford. But something in Nathan's steady presence made her think maybe, just maybe, she had found an ally in a world that seemed determined to crush her. The next morning dawned cold and clear, the October air carrying the first real bite of approaching winter. Helena woke to the smell of coffee and found that Nathan had already started the fire in the kitchen stove and set the pot to boil. He was in the barn tending to the horses when she emerged, and she stood in the doorway watching him work with the kind of quiet competence that spoke of a lifetime around animals. "You don't have to do the housework," she called. "I can manage my own cooking and cleaning." "Didn't think you couldn't," Nathan replied without looking up from brushing down her mare. "Just figured you had enough on your mind without worrying about starting fires before dawn. Most men wouldn't think of it. Most men are fools." He moved to the next stall, his hands sure and gentle on the horse's flank. "Your mare's left front shoe is loose. I can fix it if you've got the tools." "Blacksmith shed, though I'm not sure what condition Thomas left it in." She hesitated, then added, "He wasn't much for maintenance the last few months. I think he knew his heart was failing even if he wouldn't admit it." Nathan nodded, filing that information away. "I'll check the fences today, see what needs mending before the weather turns." You planning to go into town? The thought made her stomach clench. I need supplies, but I'm not sure I'm ready to face them all again. I can go if you make a list. Might be easier. They'll just add you to their list of my sins, Helena warned. Working for the poisoner, probably her lover, definitely damned by association. Let them talk. Nathan's voice was hard now, flint striking steel. I've been hearing what people think of me my whole life. Their opinions fill my belly about as much as wind does. Helena found herself studying him more carefully in the morning light. His features were angular, sharp-carved, and she could see the indigenous heritage in his cheekbones and the straight black of his hair, though his eyes were lighter, perhaps from a white father. It would have been enough to mark him as an outsider in most places, someone to be used for labor and discarded when convenient, never quite accepted or trusted. The realization that they were both outcasts in their own ways should have been depressing, but instead Helena felt a strange kinship forming. I'll make a list, she said, but I'm coming with you. I won't hide like I've done something wrong. Nathan looked at her then, really looked, and something like respect flickered in his expression. All right, we'll go together. The ride into Watsonville took 30 minutes, and Helena felt her courage faltering with every step. The town wasn't large, maybe 500 people if you counted all the outlying farms and ranches, but it was the only real civilization for 20 miles in any direction. The main street boasted a general store, a saloon, a church, a bank, a hotel, and a scattering of smaller businesses that served the farming community. Helena had never loved the place, but she had hoped to find at least tolerance here. Instead, she had found judgment. They hitched their horses outside the general store, and Helena felt the weight of stares immediately. Mrs. Henderson stood on the boardwalk with 2 other women, their conversation dying as Helena approached. The looks they gave her were venomous, and Mrs. Henderson's eyes raked over Nathan with open disdain. Didn't take you long to find replacement, did it? Mrs. Henderson said loudly enough for half the street to hear. Husband not even cold in the ground. Mr. Miles is working the ranch, Helena said, proud that her voice stayed steady. Unless you'd prefer I lose the property entirely and become the town's charity case. I'd prefer you show some decency and respect for your dead husband, Mrs. Henderson shot back. But I suppose that's too much to expect from a woman like you. Nathan moved then, not threateningly but with deliberate presence, positioning himself slightly between Helena and the older woman. Madam, you're speaking to a grieving widow. Might want to remember that before you say things you can't take back. And who are you to tell me anything, Mrs. Henderson's face flushed with indignation. Some drifter she's taken up with. You're probably the reason Thomas is dead in the first place. Helena felt Nathan tense beside her, saw his hands curl into fists, but his voice remained level. I'm someone who knows slander when I hears it. You've got accusations, take them to the sheriff. Otherwise, maybe mind your own business. This is our business when there's a murderess living among us, Mrs. Cooper chimed in. We have a right to protect ourselves and our families. From what? Helena demanded, her own anger rising now. From a woman who nursed her husband and honored her vows and did nothing but try to live quietly. The doctor said it was his heart. There was no poison, no foul play, just a sick man who died too young. Why isn't that enough for you? Because it's convenient, isn't it, Mrs. Henderson stepped closer, her voice dropping to something almost intimate in its cruelty. You get everything, the land, the house, the freedom to do as you please. Young pretty thing like you trapped with an old drunk. I imagine you dreamed about this day. The slap of her words was worse than a physical blow, and Helena felt her breath catch. She had dreamed, sometimes of freedom, of being young without the weight of obligation and sacrifice, but never of Thomas's death, never of gaining at the cost of a life. That's enough." Nathan's voice cracked like a whip, and suddenly his easy cowboy demeanor was gone, replaced by something dangerous and barely controlled. "You want to spread poison, fine, but don't do it to her face. Have the courage to be cowards behind closed doors like decent hypocrites." Mrs. Henderson drew herself up to her full height, which still left her several inches shorter than Nathan. "How dare you speak to me that way? I'll have my husband." "Have your husband what?" Nathan challenged. "Come out to the ranch and try to scare off the hired help. Tell the widow she's not welcome in the town her husband helped build. You want to start that fight, madam, you go right ahead. But know that I'm standing right here, and I don't scare easy." The standoff lasted another few heartbeats before Mrs. Henderson turned on her heel and stalked away, her companions scurrying after her like hens following a rooster. Helena stood rooted to the boardwalk, her heart hammering and her hands shaking with adrenaline and gratitude and something dangerously close to admiration. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did." Nathan's jaw was still tight, but he was already settling back into his usual calm. "Come on, let's get your supplies before they decide to refuse service too." The general store was mercifully empty except for Mr. Patterson, the owner, who had always been fair if not particularly friendly. He served them without comment, tallying up Helena's purchases with professional efficiency. She had worried he might refuse her credit, but he simply marked the total in his ledger and nodded when she promised to settle the account at month's end. They were loading the supplies into the wagon when Sheriff Dawson approached, his badge catching the midday sun. He was a thick-set man in his 40s, competent enough at keeping the peace but not known for standing against popular opinion. "Mrs. Tucker," he said with a tip of his hat. "Heard there was a disturbance." "Mrs. Henderson decided to share her theories about my husband's death," Helena replied. "I wouldn't call it a disturbance so much as slander." Dawson shifted uncomfortably. "People are concerned. When a man dies suddenly like that, questions get asked." "The doctor answered those questions," Nathan interjected. "Said it was heart failure, signed the death certificate, everything legal and proper." "What more do people need? People need to feel safe in their community," Dawson said, but he wouldn't meet Nathan's eyes. "When there's doubt—" "There's no doubt," Helena interrupted. "There's just gossip and cruelty. My husband died of natural causes. I've done nothing wrong, and I'd appreciate if the law would protect citizens instead of persecuting them based on rumors." The sheriff's face hardened. "I'm not persecuting anyone, Mrs. Tucker. But I also can't stop folks from having opinions." "You can stop them from harassing her on the street," Nathan said. "That's literally your job." "Now you listen here," Dawson turned on Nathan. "I don't know who you are or what your stake is in this, but I'd advise you not to tell me how to do my job. Mrs. Tucker wants to avoid trouble. Maybe she should think about selling up and moving on. Fresh start somewhere nobody knows her history." Helena felt the words like a punch. "This is my home. My husband's grave is here. I have every right to stay." "Right and wise aren't always the same thing," Dawson said. "I'm just suggesting that sometimes it's easier to bend than break. Think about it." He walked away, leaving Helena and Nathan standing in the street with their loaded wagon and the bitter taste of injustice. The message was clear. The law wouldn't protect her, the town wouldn't accept her, and she was expected to simply disappear to make everyone else comfortable. "I'm not leaving," she said, more to herself than Nathan. "I won't let them drive me away." "Good." Nathan swung up onto the wagon seat. "Then we've got a ranch to run." They rode back in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Helena felt the fight rising in her, the stubborn determination that had gotten her through her father's death, and her marriage and every other hardship life had thrown at a girl with no money and fewer options. She might be alone, might be hated, but she wasn't weak. And now, it seemed, she wasn't quite as alone as she had thought. Nathan proved himself invaluable over the following days. He mended fences and repaired the barn roof, shoed horses and doctored sick cattle, worked from dawn to dusk without complaint or expectation of praise. Helena found herself watching him sometimes, noticing the careful way he moved, the quiet competence that spoke of hard-won skill. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words were thoughtful, considered, worth hearing. They fell into a routine that felt almost comfortable. Helena cooked breakfast while Nathan tended the animals. They worked separately through the day, and in the evenings they would sit on the porch discussing what needed doing next. It was practical, professional, nothing that should have caused comment. But of course, it did. The first letter appeared nailed to her door 4 days after their confrontation with Mrs. Henderson. Helena found it at dawn, 3 words scrawled in angry script: whore, murderess, leave. She stood staring at it, the paper fluttering in the morning breeze, and felt something cold settle into her bones. This wasn't just gossip anymore. This was threat. Nathan appeared at her shoulder, his face darkening as he read the message. Without a word, he pulled the nail free and crumpled the paper in his fist. "We should tell the sheriff," Helena said, but she already knew it was pointless. "He won't do anything. Probably say you wrote it yourself for attention." Nathan's voice was bitter with experience. "But we can make sure it doesn't happen again. I'll sleep in the house, on the floor in the front room. If someone comes creeping around at night, they'll have to go through me first. Nathan, that will only make the talk worse. Let it. Your safety matters more than their gossip." He looked at her then, and something in his eyes made her breath catch. "I meant what I said about standing beside you. I don't say things I don't mean." "Why?" The question burst out of her, raw and desperate. "Why do you care what happens to me? You barely knew Thomas, don't know me at all. Why risk yourself for someone else's fight?" Nathan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke, his voice was soft but weighted with old pain. "My mother was Shoshone. My father was white. He loved her, or said he did, but when she got pregnant, he wouldn't marry her. Couldn't face his family with a native wife. She raised me alone, and the tribe never fully accepted me because of my mixed blood. She died when I was 14, and I've been drifting ever since, never quite fitting anywhere." He focused on Helena again. "I know what it's like to be judged for things you can't control. And I know how much it means when someone stands up and says enough. Maybe nobody did that for my mother, but I can do it for you." Helena felt tears prick her eyes for the second time since meeting this strange, quiet man. "I'm sorry about your mother. Me too." He turned toward the barn. "I'll get my bedroll moved after breakfast, and Helena, we're going to get through this. However long it takes, however hard they push, we'll get through it." She believed him, and that belief felt like the first solid ground she had stood on in weeks. True to his word, Nathan moved his essentials into the front room that evening. He kept his bedroll neat and unobtrusive, his few possessions tucked away, making it clear this was about protection, not presumption. Helena appreciated the respect, even as she felt the strange intimacy of having him so close, separated only by a doorway and the darkness. She lay awake that first night listening to the house settle, imagining she could hear Nathan breathing in the next room. It should have been awkward, should have felt improper, but instead she felt safer than she had in years. Thomas had been a physical presence, but never a protection. He was too drunk too often, too lost in his own slow decline to be a shield against anything. Nathan was different. Nathan was alert, capable, present in a way that made her feel seen. The thought terrified her. She wasn't supposed to notice these things. She was a widow in mourning, a woman under siege, focused on survival, not attraction. But her heart didn't seem to care about propriety or proper timelines. It noticed Nathan's rare smiles and the way he gentled horses with patient hands. It noticed his broad shoulders and the quiet strength in every movement. It noticed, and it wanted, and Helena had no idea what to do with that dangerous truth. The second letter came 3 days later, this one left in the yard weighted with a rock. The words were uglier, more explicit in their accusations and threats. Nathan burned it without showing her the full text, but she saw enough to understand the hatred being directed at her. "They're getting bolder," Nathan said. "We need to be more careful, or I could leave." The words tasted like ash, but Helena forced them out. Maybe the sheriff was right. Maybe it would be easier. "Easier isn't better." Nathan's voice was firm. "You leave, they win. They learn they can drive out anyone they don't like with enough cruelty. What happens to the next person who doesn't fit their narrow little view? You staying, fighting back with just living your life, that matters." "It's just land," Helena argued, though her heart wasn't in it. "Just property and bad memories. It's your land, your freedom, your future." Nathan moved closer, his eyes intense. "And it's not just bad memories. Thomas might not have been the love of your life, but he gave you something when he married you. He gave you independence, security, a chance to build something of your own. Don't throw that away because some bitter people can't stand seeing a young woman with her own property." Helena stared at him, startled by the passion in his usually measured voice. "You really believe that?" "I do." He held her gaze. "I believe you deserve every good thing, and I believe you're strong enough to fight for it. But you don't have to fight alone." The air between them felt charged, electric with things unsaid and feelings too new to name. Helena wanted to step closer, wanted to reach out and touch his face, trace the line of his jaw, feel if his skin was as warm as it looked. But fear held her back, fear of moving too fast, of confirming all the terrible things being said about her, of losing this fragile alliance before it had a chance to become something more. Instead, she said, "Thank you, Nathan, for everything." His expression softened. "You don't have to thank me. I'm where I want to be." That night, Helena did reach out in the darkness, letting her fingers drift toward the doorway that separated them, wishing she had the courage to cross that threshold and tell him that she was beginning to want him there for more than protection. The harassment escalated over the following weeks. Someone cut sections of fence, letting part of the herd wander. Helena's milk cow was found dead, clearly poisoned. The windows of the ranch house were broken while they were in the barn, forcing them to board them up against the approaching winter cold. Each incident brought a visit to the sheriff, and each visit ended with the same sympathetic shrug and suggestion that Helena should consider leaving. Through it all, Nathan stayed. He worked harder to compensate for the sabotage, spent nights on watch, faced down the occasional group of men who rode out to check on things with thinly veiled intimidation. He never wavered, never suggested Helena give in, never made her feel like a burden. And slowly, inevitably, Helena fell in love with him. It wasn't a sudden realization but a gradual recognition of truth, like watching dawn break over the mountains. She loved the way he talked to the horses, soft words in 2 languages that soothed and gentled. She loved his rare laughter, the way his whole face transformed when something genuinely amused him. She loved his hands, scarred and capable, equally suited to mending tack or cooking supper when she was too exhausted to manage. She loved his unshakable sense of right and wrong, his refusal to be cowed by popular opinion. She loved him, and it was both the best and most terrifying thing she had ever felt. Helena didn't know if Nathan felt the same. He was unfailingly respectful, maintaining careful distance even as they spent increasing amounts of time together. He never touched her unnecessarily, never said anything that couldn't be interpreted as simple friendship. But sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something hungry and careful and almost wistful, and she wondered if maybe, possibly, he was fighting the same internal battle she was. November arrived with cold rain and the first real storms of winter. The ranch work became harder, muddy and miserable, but they persevered. Helena found herself working beside Nathan more often, their movements synchronizing without conscious effort. They became a team, partners in the endless labor of keeping the ranch functioning despite the town's best efforts to destroy it. It was during one of these storms, both of them soaked to the bone and fighting to get the cattle into shelter, that everything changed. Helena slipped in the mud going down hard, and Nathan was there instantly, pulling her up with strong hands. For a moment they stood frozen, his arms around her waist, her hands on his shoulders, rain streaming down both their faces. "You all right?" Nathan asked, having to shout over the storm. "Yes," Helena shouted back, but she didn't step away. Neither did he. They stood there in the rain and mud, the cattle lowing around them, and Helena saw the careful distance in Nathan's eyes crack. He looked at her like she was something precious and impossible, something he wanted but couldn't let himself reach for. "Nathan," she said, though the wind tore his name away. He understood anyway. His hand came up to cup her face, gentle despite the calluses, and Helena leaned into the touch like a plant toward sun. "We can't," Nathan said, but he didn't pull away. "They already think the worst if we give them proof. I don't care anymore." Helena was surprised to find it was true. "Let them think what they want. I'm tired of living my life based on their approval." "Helena." Her name was a plea and a prayer. "Are you sure? Because if I kiss you, if I let myself feel what I've been trying not to feel, there's no going back. I won't be able to be just your hired hand anymore." "Then don't be." She rose on her toes, bringing their faces closer. "Be something else. Be something more." Nathan's restraint shattered. He kissed her there in the storm, his lips cold and seeking against hers, and Helena felt like she was coming alive for the first time in her life. This wasn't the dutiful acceptance of Thomas's infrequent attentions. This was fire and want and mutual desperate need. She kissed Nathan back with everything she had been holding in, all the fear and loneliness and growing love pouring out in that single connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Nathan pressed his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "I have for weeks. I tried to keep it professional, but I can't anymore. I love you and I want a life with you if you'll have me." "Yes." Helena was laughing and crying at the same time, joy mixing with relief. "Yes, I want that. I want you. I love you, Nathan." They kissed again, softer this time but no less intense, and the storm raged around them unnoticed. Eventually they broke apart and finished securing the cattle, but everything felt different now. The work was still hard, the situation still dire, but they were facing it together in a new way, as partners not just in labor but in life. That night, propriety be damned, Helena invited Nathan to her bedroom. They made love with slow exploration, learning each other's bodies with reverent attention. Nathan was patient and thorough, making sure Helena felt safe and cherished with every touch. For her part, Helena discovered a passion she hadn't known she possessed, a fierce desire to give and receive pleasure that had been dormant during her practical marriage. Afterward, lying tangled in her bed with Nathan's arm around her and his heartbeat steady under her ear, Helena felt something she had never expected to feel, complete happiness. "What happens now?" she asked into the warm darkness. "Now we keep fighting." Nathan's voice rumbled in his chest. "We keep the ranch running. We ignore the gossips and we build a life worth living. And when enough time has passed that it won't cause a complete scandal, I'm going to marry you properly." "How much time?" Helena asked, smiling against his skin. "However long it takes for me not to care about your reputation being damaged further." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "I won't give them ammunition by rushing into marriage. But make no mistake, Helena Tucker, you're mine and I'm yours, and eventually everyone will know it." "I like the sound of that." She tilted her head to kiss his jaw. "Though I suspect knowing it will only make them hate me more. Let them. We'll face it together." And they did. The rest of November and into December brought more harassment, more threats, more attempts to drive Helena away. But now she had Nathan not just as an ally but as a partner, and the difference was everything. They drew strength from each other, found joy in stolen moments, and built a life together within the walls of the ranch even as the outside world condemned them. The town's hostility reached a peak the week before Christmas. Helena was in town alone, Nathan having stayed back to watch the ranch, when she encountered a group of women outside the church. Mrs. Henderson was there, along with 4 others, all dressed in their Sunday best despite it being a Wednesday. "Well, well," Mrs. Henderson said loudly. "The widow emerges from her love nest. Tell me, Mrs. Tucker, does your hired hand keep you warm at night now that your husband's gone?" Helena stopped, her shopping basket heavy on her arm, and faced them. "My private life is none of your concern." "It's all our concern when you flaunt your immorality," Mrs. Cooper chimed in. "Living out there alone with that man, no chaperone, no pretense of decency. You shame your husband's memory." "Thomas was a good man who deserved better than you," Mrs. Henderson added, "if he could see what you've become." "Thomas would want me to be happy," Helena interrupted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "He told me as much before he died. He said I was young and should find joy where I could. So if you want to condemn me for taking his advice, for finding someone who treats me with respect and kindness, then go ahead. But know that your judgment says far more about you than it does about me. Respect, Mrs. Henderson's laugh was ugly. "Is that what you call it when a woman takes up with a half-breed drifter before her husband's body is cold? You're nothing but a whore, Helena Tucker, and everyone knows it." The slap came before Helena could think, her palm connecting with Mrs. Henderson's cheek with a crack that echoed down the street. The older woman staggered back, shocked, and Helena felt a fierce satisfaction despite knowing she had just made everything worse. "Don't you ever," Helena said with quiet intensity, "call the man I love a half-breed like it's something shameful. Nathan Miles is worth 10 of your cruel, small-minded husbands, and I won't stand here and let you insult him." "You admit it then," Mrs. Cooper breathed. "You admit you're carrying on with him." "I admit that I love him, yes. I admit that he's been the only source of kindness and support in a town full of people who decided I was guilty without evidence or trial. I admit that if I could leave here tomorrow and never see any of you again, I would count myself blessed." Helena picked up her basket, which had fallen during the confrontation. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have shopping to do." She walked away on shaking legs, aware of the stares and whispers following her down the street. She had just confirmed every rumor, sealed her fate as a pariah, but she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Defending Nathan felt more right than anything she had done in months. The ride back to the ranch felt endless. Helena kept replaying the confrontation, wondering if she should have kept quiet if her pride had just cost them everything. But when she arrived home and saw Nathan in the yard, his face lighting up at her approach, she knew she would do it again. "How was town?" he asked, helping her down from the wagon. "Eventful." She told him everything, watching his expression shift from concern to anger to something like wonder. "You hit Mrs. Henderson." There was a note of amusement in his voice. "I probably shouldn't have. Probably not." Nathan pulled her close, unconcerned with who might see. "But I'm glad you did. I'm glad you stood up for us." "I think I just made everything harder," Helena admitted, resting her head against his chest. "Maybe. Or maybe you just made it clear that we're not going to be bullied into hiding or shame." He tilted her face up to his. "I love you, Helena. I'm not ashamed of that, and you shouldn't be either." "I'm not," she said firmly. "I'm just worried about what comes next." What came next was a visit from the sheriff 2 days later. He rode up alone, which Helena took as either a good sign or a very bad one. "Mrs. Tucker, Mr. Miles," Dawson said with a nod to each of them. "Mind if we talk?" "Depends on what you want to talk about," Nathan replied, his hand resting casually on the gun at his hip. "No need for that." The sheriff dismounted, keeping his hands visible. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to give you a warning." "A warning about what?" Helena asked. Dawson looked uncomfortable. "There's talk in town. Bad talk. Some of the men are saying things ought to be done about your situation here. They're calling it a moral outrage, saying someone needs to protect the community's values." "By doing what?" Nathan's voice was dangerous now. "I don't know specifics, but I've been a lawman long enough to know when trouble's brewing, and it's brewing now." He looked directly at Helena. "I still think you should consider selling and moving on before things get out of hand." "Are you saying you can't protect us?" Helena demanded. "I'm saying I'm one man with a deputy who's 60 years old and mostly deaf. If a dozen men decide to ride out here and cause problems, I can't stop them." Dawson's frustration was evident. "I don't like it any more than you do, but that's the reality." "Then arrest the men making threats," Nathan suggested. "Do your job." "On what charge? Talk isn't illegal, even ugly talk. I need evidence of actual plans, actual conspiracy, and nobody's stupid enough to say anything concrete where I can hear it." The sheriff shook his head. "Look, I'm trying to help here. I don't personally care what you two do or don't do, but I live in this town too. I know how people think, and right now they think you're a stain that needs removing. Please, for your own safety, think about leaving." "No," Helena's voice was flat. "This is my home and I'm staying. If you won't protect us, then we'll protect ourselves." Dawson sighed. "That's what I was afraid you'd say. Just be careful, all right. And if anything happens, if you see anyone approaching who looks like trouble, fire 3 shots. I'll hear it from town and come running." "By which time we'll be dead," Nathan observed. "Or you'll have defended yourselves and I'll be there to document it was justified. Best I can offer." The sheriff mounted up. "I'm sorry. For what it's worth, I think you're getting a raw deal. But I can't fix people being awful." He rode away, leaving Helena and Nathan standing in the yard with a new weight of dread settling over them. "We should prepare," Nathan said quietly. "If they're really planning something, we need to be ready." They spent the next 2 days fortifying the ranch house as best they could. Nathan moved furniture to create barriers, positioned weapons strategically, and showed Helena how to reload quickly. They brought supplies into the house so they could withstand a siege if necessary. It felt surreal, like preparing for war on what should have been their own land, their own sanctuary. Christmas came and went unmarked. They stayed close to the house, watching and waiting, but nothing happened. The tension was exhausting, the constant vigilance wearing them both thin. Helena found herself starting at shadows, reaching for the rifle at every sound. Nathan slept in snatches, always alert, always ready. It was 3 days after Christmas when they came. Helena woke to Nathan's hand over her mouth and his urgent whisper, "Get dressed, quietly, we have company." She pulled on clothes with shaking hands, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. Through the bedroom window she could see torches, at least a dozen of them, surrounding the house. Men on horseback, their faces covered with bandanas, illuminated by the flickering flames they carried. "Helena Tucker," a voice called out, muffled but recognizable as Mr. Henderson. "You need to leave, tonight. We've given you chances, been patient, but enough is enough. You and your lover pack up and go, or we'll burn you out." Nathan moved to the window, rifle in hand. "You're on private property," he shouted back. "You've got no right to be here making threats." "We've got every right to protect our town from immoral influences," another voice answered. "This is your last warning. Leave or burn." "We're not leaving," Helena called, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "This is my land, legally purchased and owned. You want me gone, take it up with the courts. Otherwise, get off my property before I start shooting." There was a ripple of surprise through the mob. Apparently they had expected fear, submission, easy capitulation. Helena felt a fierce pride rise in her chest. She had been pushed, harassed, threatened, and judged, but she was done backing down. "You heard her," Nathan added. "You've got to the count of 10 to clear out. After that, anyone still on this property is fair game." "You can't fight all of us," Henderson shouted. "Maybe not." Nathan's voice was cold. "But I can sure as hell take down the first 5 or 6 who try something. Question is, which of you wants to be in that group?" The mob shifted uncertainly. It was one thing to terrorize a lone widow in the dark, another entirely to face armed resistance from someone who clearly knew how to use a weapon. Helena saw Nathan's strategy. Make it personal, make them think about the cost, make them doubt. "This isn't over," Henderson yelled, but there was less conviction in his voice now. "Yes, it is." Nathan leveled his rifle. 10, 9, 8. At 5, the first man wheeled his horse around. At 3, 2 more followed. By the time Nathan reached 1, half the mob had scattered. The remaining men held for another few seconds before pride gave way to self-preservation, and they too turned away, riding back toward town with their torches trailing smoke in the cold night air. Helena and Nathan stood at the window watching until the lights disappeared, neither speaking, barely breathing. When the last glow faded beyond the hills, Helena's legs gave out and she sank to the floor, shaking uncontrollably. Nathan was beside her instantly, pulling her against his chest, his own hands trembling. "It's okay. They're gone. We're safe." "For how long?" Helena gasped out between sobs. "They'll come back, Nathan. Next time they'll be more organized, more determined. We can't fight off the whole town forever. We won't have to." Nathan's voice was grim. "Because tomorrow we're going to the territorial marshal. We're going to file official complaints, get federal law involved, make this bigger than one corrupt sheriff and one ignorant town can handle." "Will that work?" "It has to." He held her tighter. "I won't lose you, Helena. Not to them, not to fear. We've done nothing wrong, and we're going to make sure everyone knows it." The next morning they rode out before dawn, leaving the ranch unguarded but taking evidence with them. The threatening letters, a list of incidents and dates, witness testimony from the few merchants who had been decent. It was a 6-hour ride to the nearest territorial marshal's office, and every mile felt precarious, like they were riding through enemy territory. Marshal James Garrett was a weathered man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He listened to their story without interruption, examining the evidence they presented with careful attention. "This is serious," he said when they finished. "Attempted arson, destruction of property, conspiracy to intimidate. These are federal crimes, especially when local law enforcement fails to act." "Can you help us?" Helena asked, afraid to hope. "I can and I will." Garrett stood, reaching for his coat. "I'll ride back with you tonight, bring 2 deputies. We're going to arrest everyone involved in last night's events, and we're going to make it clear that vigilante justice won't be tolerated in this territory." The relief that flooded through Helena was so intense it was almost painful. "Thank you. Thank you so much." "Don't thank me yet," Garrett warned. "Arresting them is the easy part. Making charges stick, changing attitudes, that's harder. But at least you'll be safe, and that's a start." They rode back with the marshal and his deputies, arriving at the ranch as the sun set. Everything was as they had left it. No new damage or threats. That night, with armed federal lawmen sleeping in the bunkhouse, Helena and Nathan finally relaxed enough to truly rest. The arrests began the next morning. Marshal Garrett and his men rode into Watsonville, and based on Helena's descriptions and some careful investigation, identified 8 men who had been part of the mob. They were arrested publicly, handcuffed, and marched to the jail in full view of the town. The shock was palpable. These were respected citizens, business owners, family men. Seeing them treated as criminals sent a message that rippled through the community. Mr. Henderson was among those arrested, and Mrs. Henderson's screaming protests could be heard throughout town. Sheriff Dawson stood by, looking simultaneously relieved and humiliated as the marshal essentially took over his jurisdiction. "You should have handled this yourself," Garrett told Dawson coldly. "You failed in your duty, and I'll be filing a report with the territorial governor. Consider yourself lucky I'm not arresting you for negligence." Helena and Nathan watched from outside the general store, no longer bothering to hide or apologize for their presence. The townspeople who had been so quick to judge now avoided their eyes, suddenly finding the ground or sky fascinating. "How do you feel?" Nathan asked quietly. "Vindicated," Helena admitted, "and tired, so tired of fighting. It's almost over." He took her hand openly, and if anyone had opinions about it, they kept them wisely silent. "Once the trial happens and people see there are consequences for harassment, things will settle down." He was right, though the process took months. The trial was held in February, drawing attention from newspapers as far as San Francisco. The story of the widow and her cowboy defender, facing down a mob and seeking federal justice, captured public imagination. Suddenly, Helena wasn't a poisoner but a victim, a brave woman standing up for her rights. The narrative shift was dizzying, but she would take it if it meant safety. The 8 men were convicted of various charges and sentenced to fines and jail time. The sentences weren't long, but the public humiliation and financial penalties were enough to make them examples. More importantly, it sent a message to anyone else who might have been considering similar action. Leave Helena Tucker alone or face real consequences. By spring, the overt harassment had stopped. People still whispered, still judged, but they did it quietly, away from Helena's hearing. A few families even began to thaw slightly, offering cautious nods when they passed. It wasn't acceptance, not really, but it was tolerable. It was enough to build a life on. Nathan proposed properly in April, kneeling in the new grass of the spring meadow with a simple gold band he had commissioned from a jeweler in the next county over. "I know it's only been 6 months since Thomas died," he said, the ring trembling slightly in his hand. "I know people will talk. But I love you, Helena, and I want to spend my life with you. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Helena said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, absolutely yes." They married in May of 1883, a quiet ceremony with Marshal Garrett serving as witness and the circuit preacher performing the service. No one from Watsonville attended, but Helena didn't care. She married the man she loved, the man who had stood beside her when the whole world seemed determined to crush her, and that was enough. Their wedding night was sweet and passionate, a celebration of not just physical love but the partnership they had forged through adversity. Helena felt reborn, like she was finally becoming the person she was meant to be all along, life settled into a new rhythm. Nathan proved to be not just a capable ranch hand but a shrewd manager, expanding their operation and making improvements that increased profitability. Helena discovered a talent for breeding horses, producing quality stock that gained a reputation throughout the valley. They worked together, building something neither could have achieved alone. The town's attitude continued to gradually soften. Time and success were the great equalizers. As the Tucker Miles Ranch prospered and Helena and Nathan proved themselves to be hard-working, honest, and dedicated to the community despite its treatment of them, opposition faded to grudging respect to eventual, if tentative, acceptance. Mrs. Henderson never apologized, but she stopped actively spreading rumors. Mr. Henderson, chastened by his jail time and fines, avoided them entirely. Sheriff Dawson retired quietly, replaced by a younger man who made a point of treating all citizens fairly regardless of personal opinions. Helena and Nathan's first child, a daughter they named Sarah, was born in the spring of 1884. She had Helena's wheat-colored hair and Nathan's dark eyes, and she was loved beyond measure. Their second child, a son named Thomas after Helena's first husband, came 2 years later. Nathan had suggested the name, honoring the man who had, in his way, made their happiness possible by marrying Helena and setting in motion the chain of events that brought them together. As the years passed, the story of how they met, how Nathan had stood beside Helena when the whole town whispered cruel things, became something of a legend in the valley. People told it to illustrate perseverance, or true love, or the importance of standing up for what's right. The details shifted with each telling, becoming more dramatic, more romanticized, but the core remained true. A woman alone, a town's prejudice, and a man who refused to let injustice stand. Helena and Nathan grew old together on the ranch they built, surrounded by children and eventually grandchildren. They faced the usual hardships of frontier life: drought years and harsh winters, cattle disease and economic downturns, but they faced them together, and that made all the difference. In 1912, on their 29th wedding anniversary, they sat on the porch of the ranch house watching the sun set over the coastal hills. Helena was 54 now, Nathan 57, both weathered and gray but still strong, still vital. "You ever regret it?" Helena asked, taking Nathan's hand. "Standing up for me, risking everything for someone you barely knew." Nathan looked at her with the same intensity he had shown that first day when he offered to work for room and board. "Not for one single second. You were worth every risk, every fight, every moment of doubt. Loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life." "I love you too," Helena said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Thank you for standing beside me when no one else would." "Always," Nathan promised. "For as long as I live, I'll stand beside you." And he did, until he passed peacefully in his sleep in 1924 at the age of 69. Helena followed him 2 years later, dying quietly in the spring with her children and grandchildren around her. They were buried side by side on the ranch, beneath a shared headstone that read simply, "Helena and Nathan Miles." They stood together. The ranch stayed in the family for 3 more generations, a testament to what could be built with love, determination, and the courage to stand up for what's right. The story of Helena and Nathan became a family legend, told to each new generation as a reminder that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand beside someone when the whole world is against them. In the end, the whispers faded, but the love remained, etched into the land they had fought so hard to keep, living on in the descendants who bore their names and inherited their strength. And if on quiet nights when the wind blows just right across the California hills, You can still feel their presence in that valley, the widow who refused to be broken, and the cowboy who stood beside her till the whole cruel world hushed. Well, perhaps that's just the way love stories are supposed to end. Not with easy happiness, but with hard-won joy. Not with everyone's approval, but with the certainty that comes from standing by your convictions and the person you love, no matter what anyone else might say. Helena and Nathan had fought for their right to love each other, had endured harassment and hatred and threats, and had emerged victorious not because they changed people's minds, but because they refused to let those minds change them. They had built a life together that was good and true and full of love, and in doing so they had proved that sometimes the strongest rebellion is simply living well and refusing to be ashamed. Their children grew up knowing they were the product of great love, born from parents who had chosen each other despite impossible circumstances and never regretted that choice. Sarah became a teacher, dedicating her life to education and fighting prejudice wherever she encountered it. Thomas took over the ranch, managing it with the same careful wisdom his father and mother had shown. Both children married for love, taught their own children the importance of standing up for what's right, and kept their parents' memory alive through their actions and choices. The Tucker Miles Ranch became known throughout California as a place of integrity, where a handshake was as good as a contract, and where every person, regardless of background or circumstance, was treated with respect. It was a living monument to Helena and Nathan's values, proof that the way they had lived their lives mattered beyond their own happiness. In the small cemetery on the ranch property, beneath ancient oak trees that had witnessed all the years of struggle and triumph, two headstones stood side by side. Visitors sometimes stopped there, reading the names and dates, wondering about the story behind those simple markers. The family would tell them, passing down the tale of love and courage that had defined Helena and Nathan's lives. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth preserving. Because in the end, it wasn't just about one woman and one man in one small corner of California in the 1880s. It was about the universal truth that love is worth fighting for, that standing up for what's right matters even when it's difficult, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be moved from where you belong. Helena had been young when she married Thomas Tucker, practical and resigned to a life of duty rather than passion. She had expected nothing more than survival, a roof over her head and food in her belly. Instead, through tragedy and hardship, she had found something infinitely more valuable. A partner who saw her truly, loved her completely, and stood beside her when standing beside her required real courage. Nathan had been a drifter, a man caught between worlds, never quite fitting in anywhere. He had expected nothing more than temporary work and eventual movement to the next town, the next job, the next place that would tolerate him until it didn't. Instead, he had found a home, a purpose, and a love that made all his years of wandering worthwhile. Together, they had created something beautiful and lasting. Not perfect life never is, but real and good and true. They had raised children who inherited their strength and values. They had built a successful ranch that provided employment and stability for others. They had lived their lives with integrity and courage, refusing to compromise their principles even when it would have been easier to give in. And they had loved each other with a depth and constancy that inspired everyone who knew them. Their love wasn't the easy, romantic kind celebrated in poems and songs. It was the hard, daily work of choosing each other again and again, of supporting each other through difficulties, of finding joy in simple shared moments. It was the kind of love that lasts, because it's built on respect and partnership and genuine affection rather than fleeting passion. When historians later wrote about the settlement of California, about the challenges faced by pioneers and the evolution of frontier communities, occasionally they would mention the Tucker Miles case as an example of how legal protections for property rights and individual liberty gradually replaced mob justice and community coercion. It was a footnote, a minor detail in the larger story of westward expansion and territorial governance. But for the family that bore their names, for the people who lived on the land they had defended, for anyone who heard their story and took courage from it, Helena and Nathan Miles were so much more than a footnote. They were proof that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when motivated by love and principle. They were evidence that standing up for what's right, even when it costs you, is always worthwhile. They were a reminder that the most important battles are often the personal ones, fought not with weapons but with persistence and courage, and an unwavering commitment to living according to your values. As the 20th century progressed, and the world changed in ways Helena and Nathan could never have imagined, their story remained relevant. Each generation found new meaning in it, new lessons to draw from how two people had faced down hatred and prejudice with nothing but their love for each other, and their refusal to be driven away from their home. The ranch itself changed over the years, adapting to new agricultural techniques and economic realities. But the core of what Helena and Nathan had built remained, a place of integrity, hard work, and genuine care for the land and the people who worked it. It was their legacy, more valuable than any amount of money or property, more lasting than any monument. And somewhere, in whatever place exists beyond this world, perhaps Helena and Nathan stood together still, watching over the land they had loved and the family they had created, satisfied that their fight had been worth it and their love had endured beyond their mortal lives. Perhaps they looked down on the generations that followed and felt pride in what had grown from the seeds they planted in those difficult early years. Or perhaps they simply rested, content in the knowledge that they had lived fully and loved completely and stood by each other when it mattered most. That was enough. That was everything. That was the whole point of their story and the reason it continued to be told long after they were gone. In the end, love had triumphed over hatred, courage over fear, persistence over pressure to conform. Helena and Nathan had won not by changing their opponents' minds, but by refusing to let those opponents change them. They had claimed their right to happiness and built a life worth living, and in doing so, they had shown that sometimes the quietest rebellion is the most powerful one. Their story ended not with drama or grand gestures, but with the simple satisfaction of two lives well lived, two people who had found each other against all odds and held fast to that connection through every storm. It ended with children and grandchildren who carried their values forward into new generations. It ended with land that had been defended, improved, and passed down as a legacy of what love and determination could accomplish. It ended, as all the best stories do, with the promise that love like theirs never really ends at all. It continues, transformed but undiminished, in the lives of those who come after, in the land that remembers their stewardship, in the story that people still tell when they need reminding that standing up for what's right, for who you love, for where you belong, is always worth the cost. Helena Tucker, who became Helena Miles, had started as a young widow facing down a town's cruel judgment. She ended as a beloved matriarch, a successful rancher, a woman who had lived on her own terms and loved without apology. That transformation was her victory, one difficult day at a time, supported always by the man who had chosen to stand beside her. Nathan Miles, who had started as a drifter caught between two worlds, ended as a respected landowner, a devoted husband and father, a man who had found where he belonged and defended it fiercely. That belonging was his victory, claimed through courage and maintained through love. Together, they had written a story worth remembering, a testament to the power of standing together when the whole world whispers cruel things, of loving despite opposition, of building something beautiful on a foundation of mutual respect and unwavering support. Their story ended with happiness, with family, with land that bore the marks of their care and love. And that, ultimately, was the happily ever after they had fought so hard to achieve. Not perfect peace or universal approval, but the deep satisfaction of a life lived with integrity, love given and received, and the knowledge that they had made a difference in each other's lives and in the world around them. It was everything they needed, everything that mattered, everything that made their story worth telling and their love worth celebrating. The whole town had whispered cruel things, but the cowboy had stood beside her till they hushed. And then, together, they had built something so beautiful and lasting that the whispers faded into irrelevance, replaced by the stronger, truer story of two people who loved each other enough to weather any storm and create a legacy that would outlast them both. That was their ending. That was their triumph. That was the love story that began in darkness and hardship but ended in light and joy and the deep peace that comes from knowing you stood by each other when it mattered most. And it was, in every way that counted, a perfect happily ever after.